Alrighty. Hello, everybody. We've got a lecture here for World War II on the home front, the U.S. home front. You are using the note-taking packet that was passed out on Friday. This packet can also be found on our class website. So if you do not have it, please download it and print it. There is not a graphic organizer for it, but simply just a page to write on. So a blind sheet of paper could just as easily be used for this assignment. Alright, here we go. So let's start first with why Americans joined World War II. Because if you'll remember from the matching activity that we had about American isolationism versus internationalism, much of American foreign policy was, there were both examples of isolationism and internationalism. The good neighbor policy being an example of kind of internationalism and economic motivations to increase trade is going to be seen as internationalism. But for the most part, America is going to be remaining isolated, especially during the 1930s. One reason of which is we're in the Great Depression. And when the rise of totalitarian leaders in Europe are beginning in the 1930s, much of America is at best choosing to ignore it, or at worst advocating for it. The New York Times is going to come out in favor of Adolf Hitler and his work to help rebuild Germany's economy in the early stages of his rule. So Americans were, ambivalent, if not supportive, of much of the totalitarian leaders in the beginning stages. However, that's going to change by 1937, 38, 39, with a variety of programs, the Lend-Lease Act, beginning with the Neutrality Act, promising we would not get into war, but breaking those policies with neutrality, the Lend-Lease Act and the Cash and Carry Act. FDR seeing the writing on the wall that America was bound to enter. That being said, Americans did not want to join. The America First group, which sounds probably very familiar to themes today, suggested that America needs to concentrate on issues at home and should not get entangled in European issues. Much of the Axis powers at this time were betting that America was not going to join the war, and they could manipulate and push the United States to the point of getting them to join the war, but that once pushed to that point, they would not be willing or would not be able to. So what went wrong? Because spoiler alerts, America is going to join the war and really be the deciding factor in turning the tide of World War II for the Allies. So what happened? Why were Americans willing to join the war with such enthusiasm, such vigor? It can be broken down into two areas. First off, American enthusiasm was underestimated by the Axis powers. The attack on Pearl Harbor in December 7th of 1941 was intended not as a surprise attack. There were warning signs, and even right before the attack, there was a diplomatic statement describing what would happen. That statement was delayed and based on translations from our embassy, and so it didn't get to the right people in time. But really, the purpose of it was to, first off, the reason why they attacked was to, the Japanese were struggling against an embargo that the United States had placed on them. U.S. had froze Japanese assets, and Japanese were really in a tough spot with not having enough oil. And so they wanted to attack the United States to retaliate against this embargo and try and weaken that. As well as, America, they felt like America could possibly join the war, and if they hit them first, especially where it hurt, at their navy, they could cripple the United States and leave them much less likely to join the war. and it was a crippling blow. Much of our fleet in the Pacific was destroyed. That being said, the fleet and 2,400 Americans are going to die. Largest attack in U.S. history, only to be exceeded at 9/11. The reality is, though, that the ships that were attacked were an older model. Much of our fleet was coming from San Diego, and it was not quite the crippling effect that they had intended. The result is really just going to be a surge of enthusiasm to get revenge on the Japanese, as we see through this racially inspired propaganda poster. Also on the East Coast, German U-boats are going to be really consistently attacking American ships. 500 ships are going to be sunk in just a few months, about 5 months from, I believe it was June of 1942 to December of 1942. 500 shipping ships are going to be sunk. And also, the Office of Wartime Information is really going to be using its recruitment and propaganda tools to get Americans excited and get them energized to join the war effort. So, Axis powers really underestimated American enthusiasm, willingness to fight, especially during the Great Depression. They were completely wrong about that. The second reason was the Axis powers bet that America would not be able to mobilize economically. This was again during the Great Depression, and you know what? I mean, it would have been the Axis powers were betting that America would not be able to switch gears from industry to war, or like New Deal industry to wartime industry. The War Production Board is going to really help in this process. It's going to be redirecting industry, private industry, that was previously geared towards consumer goods to military supplies. The Office of Price Administration is going to really make sure that inflation does not rise. It's going to fix prices on goods, as well as promote the rationing of goods. And the result is going to be a booming economy, as we discussed in the last bit of our last lecture of the New Deal. World War II is really going to be the driving force that not only gets America out of the Depression, but really sets the stage for American prosperity for the next 50 years, in many cases. This kind of wartime economy, which we'll talk later in the next unit. GDP is going to double. Wages and employment are going to triple, and that being said, debt is going to grow by 600%. So part of the war efforts was to mobilize citizens at home, and that's what we're going to be concentrating on. Women, first and foremost, grew by a third in Homefront jobs, and that was mainly fueled by a lack of men who were off to join the military. And women really were encouraged to help on a number of different levels, whether it was at home by growing their own food through these victory gardens, or rationing supplies and materials to help for the war efforts, as well as joining industrial jobs. This is going to really alter family life in a number of very different ways. First off, we have the propaganda tool of Rosie the Riveter, this female worker. We've got the poster in the classroom, the "We Can Do It" woman, who is, it's really going to be used to empower women and show them that they can and should be entering the workforce. And that's going to stick with them for decades to come. It's going to be hard to turn that back. Latchkey kids. This is the product of a two working parent household. Dad is off at war. Mom is in a factory. So where do kids go? They're left at home. So the term latchkey kid is the child will have a key to the home around their neck, and they use that to get in and out of the house when mom and dad are not home. The effects of that is going to be unsupervised children. And we'll talk next units during the 1950s about what that looked like for American children. Women are also going to earn less pay. No surprise there. It's historically that is what happened, and shoot, even today, women are underserved in industries. The war jobs, specifically employed by the military, they're going to be serving in every branch of the military: the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force. They're going to be non-combat positions, but they are going to be used for nurses, clerical, communication jobs, and also helped, for instance, in the Air Force, do running supplies of airplanes to allow men to be freed up to participate in more combat roles. African Americans in the war. This was the big kind of dichotomy, the big hypocrisy that African Americans faced at every turn in the war, in wars during the 20th century. How could we possibly be fighting against injustice abroad when we are experiencing racism at home? And this was seen in a lot of different areas. On the home front, we're going to see segregation in housing. We learned that about the New Deal. Certain government housing was unavailable to African Americans. Jim Crow in the South is still going to be prevalent, and there are going to be a number of race riots in the North. 47 riots in 1943 alone. One in Detroit where 19 individuals are going to be killed, 19 African Americans. So there was a lot of stuff going on at home that left African Americans kind of questioning, why should we be participating in this war? The WWII campaign is going to be an African American based organization that is promoting acceptance and equality at home, victory abroad, and at home. Ultimately, though, African Americans are going to go to where the jobs are, even if there's going to be limited employment and lower salary. And in this case, there were booming job positions in the West and the South being that Sun Belt. We're going to talk about the Sun Belt in our next unit, post-World War II economy. But a lot of these military factories were beginning to build up in the South and the West. So they're going to be moving. Again, this migration from northern cities back down to the South, and then to the West. Despite this, despite the segregation, African Americans are going to be joining the war effort. They will be in segregated units, as they have been throughout the 20th century. They're going to see limited combat. One exception will be the Tuskegee Airmen, which is an all-black squadron that led some pretty incredible missions, guiding and protecting military supplies and shipments going across Europe. They're going to receive a number of restrictions and challenges just to get into the military. But again, that commitment and that service and that sacrifice will ultimately, by the end of World War II, result in an ending of segregated units. It is interesting to note that segregation will end first in the armed services before it will in American society. Kind of an interesting note. Another group that is really a fascinating story is the Navajo Code Talkers. So much of the war was based on the sending of messages and intercepting and trying to translate those messages from the enemy. Americans were really, had a huge advantage to helping the war effort when we were able to help with the cracking of the Nazi code. That was going to really kind of turn the tide in the war to help the Allies get a leg up on Hitler as well as the Japanese. On the flip side, the Japanese and Nazis were trying to crack American and Allied codes. And what we had as an advantage was this amazing set of code based on the Navajo language, used to transmit code in the Pacific, and it was never broken. That code was never able to be broken. It significantly helped our victory in the Pacific, and yeah, kind of a neat contribution. Mexican Americans and Mexican migrants on the home front had a very mixed experience. The Bracero program is going to be a legal workforce migration program that is going to bring hundreds of thousands. The total estimate is really unknown, but we know it was a huge program, hundreds of thousands of Mexican nationals, people born in Mexico, brought to the United States to help with wartime labor shortages. They're going to work in farm labor, they're going to work on railroads, and many are going to really benefit from this program, as well as many American businesses. However, that being said, much of the program was just wrought with corruption, poor living conditions, poor working conditions. Many rules were not abided by companies, and many, as we'll see in later court dates, were accused of withholding pay. And in some court cases, they lost and had to back pay these workers who essentially had their salary withheld from them. Now, after the war, this program is going to have some controversies on a number of different levels. Once American soldiers start coming back, they're going to want increased jobs. They're going to want greater employment. That being said, they're not going to be working in the jobs that these braceros were working in. So what we have is, even though the bracero program itself is beginning to scale down, we're going to have a surge of non-bracero immigrants. So people from Mexico who are coming up to fill this gap, because on the one hand, the bracero program is slowing down, and on the other hand, American soldiers who are coming back from the war are not filling these jobs. So there's a demand, there's not a lot of supply, and there's strict qualifiers for who can qualify to be a bracero. And so we have this surge of immigrants coming in to fill that need, but they're not coming through the bracero program. This is going to create fear and racial sentiments, a fear of a changing community base, a fear of lowering wages. In many cases, that fear came from Mexican Americans who saw these immigrants coming and lowering their pay. However, the reality is that kind of fear from at least Mexican Americans is going to diminish once we have Operation Wetback. And yes, that is the official term of this operation in 1954 of forced deportation. That is the official term, as sad as that is. It's going to be a military-style deportation of over 1 million individuals, not simply illegal migrants, but many Mexican Americans are going to be swept into this. Many individuals who are working legally under the Bracero program are going to be swept into this deportation. And the reality of it is going to be really kind of horrific. We have accounts of individuals just being stacked by cattle in trucks, being dumped in the deserts just on the other side of the border. There was outrage in Mexico over the treatment of these human beings, and it had mixed review in the United States. Many were pleased with the extent of the program and its quickness and swiftness under Eisenhower, which again we'll talk about in the next unit, but much outrage over the extent to which it removed these workers, as well as the methods that they used. By 1964, the Bracero program is going to end officially. You may be thinking like, oh my gosh, that's like 20 years after World War II. Yeah, there was a huge demand for workers, regardless of whether we had American citizens here or not. Whether they were just because they came home from the war, like I said, there was still a huge demand for cheaper labor. And American industries, American farmers really got used to this sort of price for workers, and they didn't want to pay more. That's kind of the reality. We got used to this cheap form of labor, and many are going to encourage this Bracero program to continue. However, the human rights abuses that were mentioned above, and the poor working conditions, the living conditions, the withholding of pay from these migrants, as well as the jobs argument, which again is really kind of a mystery in many ways, because if there were truly jobs that were needed, that were open, you wouldn't have this surge of migrants coming both legally and illegally to this country. It's a simple supply and demand kind of thing. If there were not jobs that were being willing to be taken, people would not come. In either way, the Bracero program is going to end in 1964, and results, quote unquote, illegal immigration will surge. So immigration will not end with the ending of the Bracero program. Now, Mexican Americans on the home front, specifically, we're talking citizens of the United States of Mexican descent, are going to really see the effects of this racism at home. The same sort of racism that was seen during the Bracero program and Operation Wetback. The Zoot Suit riot in Los Angeles of 1943 is a great example of this. Not great, but it's a telling example of this racism. This was stemmed by a murder trial, the Sleepy Lagoon trial, which was a kind of a mystery. It was between the two rival gangs, the 34th Street gang and I don't remember the name of the other one. The result was one individual being found dead after a confrontation the night before in what was known as Sleepy Lagoon. It was essentially a lagoon that was used for swimming because there was segregation in public swimming pools. Mexican Americans were not allowed to be in swimming pools. So in this kind of lake, lagoon, there was a gang member found dead. And, you may be thinking like, all right, well, okay, so somebody killed a gang member. What is so controversial about that? You find the criminal and you punish them accordingly. The result of this criminal investigation was really a purge of the Mexican American community. There were dozens and dozens of individuals who were brought to trial for this supposed murder. And the result was really a trial that was fueled by racial fear, anger, and wanting to punish in a kind of vindictive kind of way. And ultimately, 15 individuals were going to be tried and convicted by the judge for murder of this one individual. Later, because this trial was convicted on really very little evidence, and it was, like I said, that the environment was just filled with this kind of racial unrest. A couple decades later, that court case will be overturned, and some of the individuals will be set free based on a lack of evidence. That's setting the stage here for these riots. So a year later, after the Sleepy Lagoon trial, we have the Zoot Suit riot. And the Zoot Suit riots were a conflict between Mexican American teenagers and sailors, American sailors on leave in Los Angeles after serving in the Pacific. Zoot suits are a type of suit characterized by being large, kind of oversized, oftentimes had a pinstripe down the pants as well as the coat. And essentially, there was a brawl at a fight, or excuse me, there was a brawl at a bar, and that bar fight kind of erupted into this citywide riot where soldiers and sailors essentially went to the streets, kind of purged Mexican American communities, and really just beat up anyone that they saw, from young children to old men. It really didn't matter, and it was really just a horrible, horrible scene. Ultimately, it will spread to not just Mexican Americans. African Americans and Filipino youth are also going to be targeted. And the LA Times is really going to be blamed for sparking this unrest. They're going to be fueling the fire of this racial suspicion and hatred. And ultimately, they're going to be riling up citizens, the public, against these zoot suiters. Ultimately, the U.S. Navy will step in, and they will deem Los Angeles off limits to American soldiers. They're going to close down the ports to American sailors and really remove sailors from the city. Oh, all right. That concludes this lecture portion. We will be talking about the Japanese-American experience more in depth on Tuesday. So thank you for watching, and we'll see you on Tuesday.